This is your instructor, Teresa Pelkie. Welcome to our class. I'm looking at the donation form in our Tutorial 6 example. I also have a handout explaining how they did the layout. If you notice, in our top section, we have contact information and it's enclosed in this nice little container. This is a field set. This is an HTML form element called a field set, which puts this box here, and the legend puts the little title here. This is a very nice effect, and you can see they're doing it all throughout this form. First of all, we have our text boxes. We have indication of the type of information that will go into the box. So if I click, I can actually type into this box, and I can actually continue typing to my heart's content. So for text box, we have a max length attribute that allows you to set the maximum length that the person can type, and also a size attribute which shows the size of the box, and people can still continue to type up until a certain point regardless of the size of the box. You also, by coding in the value, you can actually put some default information into your text box. So the text box is the most common form element. Most of our form elements are created using the input tag. Here are radio buttons. Radio buttons are mutually exclusive, means that you can only select one, and once you actually click into one, you can't click out of it. Check boxes, on the other hand, once you check it, you can uncheck it. We also have our drop-down list. And notice that all of these drop-down lists actually start out with a choice. In my opinion, I think it's better to say please select one. Otherwise, if the person doesn't make any changes, you're getting the default value, which might not be true. We also have a text area, and this is a large area where we can type in a lot of information. We have a button that will submit the form, and that will send it to the server. We will talk more of that in our next class. And we also have a cancel button, and that is programmed to actually clear the form. As you notice, now nothing is there except the default information which initially was there. So let's take a look at web forms. Okay, we have the ability to create the form elements, but in order to actually retrieve the data from those elements, we need to have a program or script running on a web server. Some of the popular server technologies that work with HTML forms are CGI, ASP, PHP, and JSP. And all of those classes are offered here at Palomar. So we see that although HTML can put these elements on the page, we actually need to send this information to a server in order to have the server process and either send us some feedback or to do something else with that data, such as put it into a database. So let's take a look at how we create a form. We start out with the opening and closing form tag, and I will talk more about the form tag next class. All of the HTML form elements are located inside the opening and closing form tag. You can also have other HTML tags and other content inside also. Okay, so the most commonly used form element tag is the input tag. That is a one-sided tag, and if you notice here in XHTML we would have the closing slash, in HTML5 we would not, and most of my examples are showing the HTML5 syntax. The type attribute will tell us what type of element it is. The name attribute identifies the name so that we can connect the value the user entered with the name on the server. The ID attribute is generally used for JavaScript or CSS, and the value is actually what the user entered. So every element has to have a name and a type. In some instances, the user will put the value in some instances, we need to code in the value. So let's take a look at how this works. It is very important that we understand the concept of the name and value, because when the user puts information into these form fields, each field is connected behind the scenes with a name. And what the user is doing, they are entering a value. Whether they type something or whether they check something, it is still a way of indicating a value. And these name-value pairs are sent to the server and processed. So that when you code a form, it is very important to make sure that you give each element a unique name and have the correct value entered if it needs to be entered. Okay, so let's take a look at how we create a text box. We're looking at the input element, type equals text. Now, at minimum, we need to have the name so that we can associate whatever the user puts in with an identification for this element. Now, the user will actually type in the value, so we don't need to have a value element here. But behind the scenes, the browser is putting in, associating what the user typed for the value of this form element. There are several HTML attributes, and we see the max length, which allows us to limit the number of characters that is possible to be typed, and also the size, which limits the number of characters that are shown on the page. The label tag is used to associate some kind of caption with the form element. That really doesn't have anything to do with the server. It's used basically for style sheets and for JavaScript. So here's an example of the label tag being used. Here is our input tag, which is a text box, and we have a little bit of a caption, first name, and we have the label surrounding it. Radio buttons are created by the type attribute type equals radio. And here, as I said, we need to have a name for every element. And in this case, we need to have a value because all the user is doing is clicking. So we need to have some way to identify which click they actually clicked on. The ID is optional. Now, because radio buttons are mutually exclusive and you can only check one, all of the radio buttons have to have the same name, but they must have different values. We can check a radio button by default by either of two ways. In XHTML, we have checked equals checked. In HTML5, we just have the word checked. So either syntax is accepted. A checkbox is very similar to a radio button. Here we have type equals checkbox. It needs a name, and here again it needs a value because the user is only clicking with the mouse somewhere. So the value identifies the choice. There are two ways to actually code checkboxes. They all can have the same name, and that's totally acceptable, but they always have to have different values, or they can have different names. It just depends on how the information is being returned when the information is sent. It will either be sent as single name-value pairs or one large name-value pairs with multiple values connected with one name. Here again, we can force something to be checked by default by the checked attribute. A drop-down list is created by the opening and closing select tag, and every choice is an option tag. So by default, the first choice selected will be the default value. We can actually put a value inside the option, and that makes it a little bit easier for us because we might not want a lot of text to be a value. We can have a multiple drop-down list, which means that we can see different all the different options and have the ability to select multiple options. And this is how we do it in XHTML, multiple equals multiple. In HTML5, it would just be the single word multiple. We can also indicate a size, and that would tell the browser exactly how many of the options to display. If we wanted to, as I said earlier, the first option is selected by default. If we wanted to force a choice, the terminology here is selected. Selected equals selected in XHTML, or just the single attribute selected for HTML file. Here we have an example of a text box. It would be rows going down, columns going across, the name, and because the user enters the value, we do not need to code in a value attribute. Here we have our field set and legend elements, and they would enclose the form elements that you would want positioned inside these boxes. So the tab index would indicate the order in which you can tab into the forms, and the access key would indicate how that element can be accessed using a keyboard shortcut, and you would really need to give the user some kind of an indication that that is possible and what the keyboard shortcut would be. Text boxes can also be made to be read-only or disabled, and here I have the XHTML syntax. Underneath I have the HTML5 syntax. And this is something that you probably wouldn't have a reason to do unless you were doing something with a server technology or with JavaScript. So here we have an example of type equals hidden, where we're sending some hidden fields, some hidden information to the browser. The type equals file, we'll put this browse button so that we can actually click and upload a file. And here again, this needs to be handled differently on the server rather than just sending name value pairs. Type equals image also is used with the source attribute so that we can put a graphic on our page and click it and submit the form. The submit button, input type equals submit. In your buttons, you really don't need to have a name. Here again, the ID is for JavaScript or CSS, and this is very different than traditional input tags. The value is what the button says. And what the submit button does, it calls the action of the form and submits the form, and we will look at this in more detail next week. The reset button clears the form, and here again the value will allow you to put what you want to put on the button. And finally the command button, which here again is pretty much only used with JavaScript, will allow you to just put a button on the page.